On a cold February morning in 1972, Air Force One descended through the smog-choked skies of Beijing. Inside the plane sat Richard Nixon, the President of the United States, a man who had built his entire political career on rabid anti-communism. He was about to shake hands with Mao Zedong, the leader of the most populous communist nation on earth. To the world watching on grainy television screens, it looked like diplomacy. It looked like détente. It looked like a strategic masterstroke to split the communist bloc and isolate the Soviet Union. But if you could have seen into the future, if you could have looked at the economic data of 2025, you would have realized that Nixon wasn't just opening diplomatic relations. He was opening the gates to the Treasury. He was signing the deed of transfer for American economic supremacy. This is the story of the greatest wealth transfer in human history. It is the story of how the United States, in a desperate attempt to win the Cold War, created a rival that would eventually challenge its dominance. It is the story of how America didn't lose its manufacturing base to an invading army. It lost it to a purchase order. It is the story of how the West built China, and how China is now buying the West. To understand how this happened, we have to go back to 1978, 2 years after Mao's death. China was on its knees. The Great Leap Forward had killed tens of millions through famine. The Cultural Revolution had destroyed the educated class and left the economy in ruins. The average Chinese worker earned less than $200 a year. The country had no foreign reserves. It had no modern infrastructure. It had no technology. It was an agrarian society with nuclear weapons, a giant North Korea. But then a small man with enormous pragmatism took power. His name was Deng Xiaoping. Deng had been purged twice during Mao's madness. He had watched his son thrown from a window by Red Guards, crippled for life. He had survived by working in a tractor factory. He emerged from this crucible with a singular obsession. Ideology was worthless. Only wealth mattered. Only power mattered. He famously said, "It doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice." What he meant was that he didn't care if China was communist or capitalist. He cared about results. He cared about dragging China out of poverty. And he realized that to do this, he needed the one thing China didn't have: capital, technology, and access to markets. He needed the West. In 1978, Deng launched the policy known as Reform and Opening Up. He opened special economic zones in coastal cities like Shenzhen. He invited foreign companies to build factories. He offered them something no other country could: an endless supply of cheap, disciplined, educated labor. But more importantly, he offered them access to a market of 1 billion people. The pitch was simple. Bring your factories to China. Teach us how to make your products. In exchange, we'll let you sell to our people. We'll give you tax breaks.
We'll build the roads and the ports. We'll keep the workers docile. American corporations looked at this offer and saw a gold mine.
In the 1980s, American manufacturing was struggling. Unions were strong, wages were high, environmental regulations were tightening. The profit margins were shrinking. Then China appeared, offering to make the same products for 1/10 of the cost. The decision was easy. Wall Street loved it. The stock prices of companies that moved to China soared. The executives who offshored production got massive bonuses. The shareholders got dividends. It was presented as inevitable globalization, the triumph of free markets, the end of history. But what was actually happening was a slow-motion liquidation of the American industrial base. In 1985, the United States ran a trade surplus with China. American exports to China were greater than Chinese imports. By 1990, that had flipped. By 2000, the U.S. was running a trade deficit of $83 billion with China. By 2018, that deficit had exploded to $419 billion. Every single year, hundreds of billions of dollars were flowing from the United States to China. Think about what that means. It means that every year, America was buying more from China than China was buying from America. The difference had to be paid in dollars. Those dollars piled up in Beijing. China was accumulating the largest foreign exchange reserves in human history. By 2014, China held over $4 trillion in reserves. It was a mountain of American currency. But the Chinese Communist Party didn't just sit on this money. They used it brilliantly. They used it to buy American Treasury bonds. By lending money back to the United States, China became America's banker. By 2025, China holds over $1 trillion in U.S. government debt. Think about the strategic implications. The United States is in debt to its primary geopolitical rival. China, a communist dictatorship, is funding the American government. If China decided to dump its treasury holdings, it could trigger a financial crisis in the United States. It is the ultimate leverage. It is the debt trap, but in reverse. But the transfer of wealth wasn't just financial. It was technological. When American companies moved their factories to China, they didn't just move the assembly lines. They moved the knowledge. The Chinese government had a policy: if you want to sell in China, you have to share your technology. You have to form a joint venture with a Chinese partner. You have to train Chinese engineers. The Western corporations agreed. They were so blinded by the short-term profits that they didn't see the long-term threat. General Electric taught the Chinese how to build jet engines. Apple taught them how to design smartphones. Tesla is currently teaching them how to build electric cars. Every single technology transfer was justified as necessary to access the Chinese market. But what was really happening was that China was systematically downloading the intellectual capital of the West. By the 2010s, the student had become the competitor. Chinese companies weren't just copying Western products anymore. They were innovating. Huawei became a leader in 5G technology. DJI dominated the global drone market. Baidu became the world's largest electric vehicle manufacturer. The factories that had been built to serve Western consumers were now producing Chinese brands that were conquering the world. In 2001, the United States made a decision that historians will debate for centuries. The Clinton administration, backed by both Republicans and Democrats, lobbied hard to allow China to join the World Trade Organization. The argument was that integrating China into the global trading system would make it more democratic. They believed that as the Chinese people got richer, they would demand political freedom. They believed that economic engagement would liberalize the regime. It was a fantasy. It was wishful thinking, dressed up as policy. What actually happened was the opposite. The Chinese Communist Party used the wealth generated by trade to strengthen its grip on power. It built a surveillance state. It crushed dissent. It imprisoned millions of Uyghurs in concentration camps. And the West, dependent on Chinese manufacturing, said nothing. Because by 2010, the West had created a problem. It had become addicted to cheap Chinese goods. American consumers wanted $20 toasters and $500 smartphones. Walmart's entire business model depended on Chinese imports. If China stopped shipping, the shelves would be empty within weeks. The West had outsourced not just its manufacturing, its economic sovereignty. The turning point came in 2008. When the financial crisis hit, the American economy collapsed. Banks failed. The stock market crashed. Unemployment soared. The U.S. government had to borrow trillions of dollars to bail out Wall Street. And who did they borrow from? China. While America was in crisis, China was thriving. The Chinese government unleashed a $50–160 billion stimulus package. They built entire cities. They constructed high-speed rail networks that connected the country. They poured concrete on a scale that defied imagination. In 2011 alone, China used more cement than the United States had used in the entire 20th century. The message was clear. The American model had failed. The Chinese model was succeeding, and the developing world was watching. For decades, poor countries had been told that the path to prosperity was democracy and free markets. But China offered a different model: authoritarian capitalism. A strong state that controlled the economy, crushed dissent, but delivered growth. And it was working. China had lifted 800 million people out of poverty. It had become the world's second-largest economy. It was building infrastructure in Africa, Asia, and Latin America through the Belt and Road Initiative. It was offering loans and investment to countries that the West had ignored. It wasn't asking for democracy or human rights. It was asking for access to resources and markets. By 2015, the geopolitical tables had turned. For the first time since the British Empire, a non-Western power was challenging the global order. China was no longer just a factory. It was a technological competitor, a military power, and a financial giant. The United States looked at this rising rival and realized with horror what it had done. American policymakers had spent 40 years assuming that China would remain a cheap labor platform. They had assumed that the high-value design and innovation would stay in America while the low-value assembly would be done in China. But China hadn't stayed in its lane. It had climbed the value chain, and now it was threatening to overtake the United States in critical technologies. Artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotechnology, and green energy. The Americans tried to respond. The Trump administration launched a trade war, imposing tariffs on Chinese goods. The Biden administration continued the pressure, restricting the export of advanced semiconductors to China. But it was too late. The damage had been done. 40 years of technology transfer, 40 years of trade deficits, 40 years of building up a rival could not be undone with tariffs. The story of America and China is a story of unintended consequences. The United States thought it was using China as a pawn in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. It thought it was exploiting cheap labor to boost corporate profits. It thought it was spreading democracy through commerce. But what it was actually doing was financing its own displacement. It was repeating the exact same mistake that Britain made in the early 20th century. Britain, exhausted by World War I, turned to the United States for money and manufacturing. In doing so, it handed over economic supremacy. Now, America, exhausted by decades of wars in the Middle East and financial crises, has turned to China, and China, like America before it, has used that opportunity to build itself into a superpower. The difference is that China learned from history. It learned that the key to power is not military might alone, it is economic control. It is owning the supply chains. It is holding the debt. It is having the technology. In 2025, the world is witnessing a slow-motion transfer of power. China is the largest trading partner of over 120 countries. It is the largest creditor to the developing world. It is the dominant player in critical supply chains for everything from solar panels to electric vehicle batteries. The American dollar is still the global reserve currency, but its dominance is being challenged. China is pushing for trade to be conducted in yuan. It is building alternative financial systems to bypass the dollar. The United States still has the most powerful military, but it is stretched thin. It has bases around the world, but it is struggling to pay for them. It has aircraft carriers. But China is building missiles specifically designed to sink them. The Americans are waking up to the reality that they are no longer the sole superpower. They are now in a competition with a rival that has studied their playbook and is using it against them. The financial injustice of this story is profound. The American working class paid the price for this policy. When the factories closed and moved to China, it wasn't the CEOs or the shareholders who suffered. It was the workers in Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Their jobs disappeared. Their towns died. Their wages stagnated for 40 years. The opioid crisis, the political polarization, the rage that fuels populism in America today, all of it can be traced back to the economic decisions made in boardrooms in Capitol Hill in the 1990s and 2000s. The elites got rich. The corporations made record profits, but the social contract was shattered. Meanwhile, in China, the Communist Party used the wealth to entrench its power. The Chinese people got richer, but they did not get freedom. The surveillance state grew. The censorship tightened. The party crushed Hong Kong's democracy. It threatens Taiwan. It bullies its neighbors. The hope that trade would bring freedom was a lie. It brought prosperity to the regime and chains to the people. The lesson of this story is that nations do not have friends. They have interests, and when those interests conflict with the well-being of their own citizens, the people pay the price. The American elite chose short-term profits over long-term strategy. They chose the stock market over the social fabric. They chose globalization over national interest. And now, the bill is coming due. China is not a partner, it is a competitor. It is a rival system that seeks to reshape the world in its image. And the irony is that America paid for it. Every dollar spent at Walmart, every iPhone assembled in Shenzhen, every treasury bond bought by Beijing was a brick in the foundation of Chinese power. The silent conquest is nearly complete. The question now is whether the West will wake up in time, or whether history will record the 21st century as the Chinese century, funded by American consumers and built on the ruins of American industry.
This is financial injustice.